Welcome back. You're watching Today on ENCA, DSTV Channel 43 with me, Dan Moena. Well, if you've just joined us, the repo rate has been hiked by 50 basis points. But just as that was happening, the rand was taking a pounding. DEVAN Murugan is joining us again. Good afternoon once more. What's happening now to the currency?
Well, whatever the reason is, and it's very difficult to determine how the rand behaves. But having said that, the rand has weakened to its lowest point on the intraday movements. And again, it just adds fuel to the fire. I mean, we had the Reserve Bank governor tell us that the weak currency is one of the reasons, over and above load shedding, over and above global circumstances, that we have inflation so high, and high inflation is why they react so aggressively. So long and short of it, today we've got a 50 basis point hike, the repo rate now sitting at 8.75. That the Reserve Bank sells to other bank money.
Yeah. And commercial banks are going to now be up at 11.75.
That's the prime lending rate. So we're in a bit of a tough situation. I want to bring in economist Davi Root very quickly. Davi, thanks very much indeed for talking to us. I mean, I don't want to put you in a spot, but the rand behaves quite strangely at times. Irrespective of the reason, Davi Root, the fact that the rand has now just lost 2.5% ever since that interest rate decision. I mean, it's bad news once again when it comes to inflation, isn't it?
Without a doubt. You know, the rand, I'm looking at the market at the moment, is trading at 1970. But what I'm particularly concerned about is not only the rand that's weakened quite a lot after the announcement by the Reserve Bank, but the capital market also weakened quite a lot. If you look at the longer dated bonds, for example, they're weakened here by something like 20 points or so. Now, that is very, very bad news when it comes to fiscal policy. But, you know, I've been trying to think about this because this is not supposed to happen.
No,
why is the rand suddenly behaving so weak?
Yeah, I was saying, Davi Root, generally speaking, it would have been the other way. When the interest rate rises, you also get a strengthening of the rand. Didn't happen today, quite the opposite.
Yes, and I'm trying to figure out what's happened here. I can think of two possible reasons. The one is I listened to the governor, and the governor was quite concerned. That is very, very clear. And the governor indicated that there's potential upward risk to the inflation rate. So perhaps he spooked the markets. Perhaps the markets are just scared of the outlook, the potential outlook for the South African economy. That could be one. Another possible reason is that the financial markets are simply not believing the Reserve Bank anymore, that the Reserve Bank can, in fact, do something to get inflation lower eventually. And that's perhaps the reason why the capital market is bombing out. So those are two possible reasons that I could think of. I can just tell you, I just saw the rand trading at 1973 to the US dollar, and that's the worst I've seen the rand ever trading against the US dollar. So there is some sort of overreaction by the financial markets. I still can't figure out what it is, but you are right. If these kind of levels are maintained, then eventually, I'm afraid to say, it will be a negative feedback loops, as economists call it, and it means that the Reserve Bank will have to keep on increasing interest rates to fight inflation, but the continuous increase in interest rates means that the rand will continue to come under pressure, and that simply doesn't make sense. We have to wait a little bit to see if we can figure out what's going on at the moment.
Davi, today in his reaction, Reserve Bank Governor Lesetja Kganyago was saying he has to do this, the bank has to do this. It would be some short-term pain, but in the long run, he hopes that this tool used to tame inflation works, as it did in the past, and South Africans in the long run will benefit from this because you would get the value of the rand protected. But we've asked you this question before. At what point does interest rate just become a blunt instrument where inflation tends to get carried away? Because he did say inflation is not where it's supposed to be anyway. It's still a risk.
Yeah, well, the governor spent some time today to explain to us when monetary policy is restrictive. Now, I don't want to get too technical, but the point is basically there's a certain point when interest rates are so high that it's starting to become a drag on the economy. And that's exactly what the Reserve Bank is trying to achieve, is to put some dampen on general demand in the economy. And the Reserve Bank and the governor reckons that's where we are at the moment. But a very important point to make, you are absolutely right. Monetary policy is a very blunt instrument. Monetary policy rise in interest rates is damaging to the economy. It's bad for economic growth. It leads to unemployment and poverty and everything like that. But that is all that we can do. There are many other things that can and should be done to get inflation lower. But those things are politically just not feasible to do. Like, for example, we don't have electricity, making us very uncompetitive. The railroads do not work. The local authorities do not work. And the list goes on and the list goes on. And since those things do not work, it leads to an upward pressure on inflation, and it forces the Reserve Bank to use this very blunt instrument called inflation. The alternative, if the Reserve Bank does not do this, is that it will lead to much higher levels of inflation, and that guarantees weak economic growth, and that guarantees all sort of bad things that will happen, especially to the poor. So the right answer is to fix those other things in the economy, and I think that message, hopefully, and that's in fact what the governor also said, he pointed to that, and I hope this message will get to the politicians. You must fix the structural issues in the economy, because we cannot keep on leaning this much on the Reserve Bank to get inflation lower.
Davi Rood, it's interesting you say that, because the Reserve Bank governor this afternoon suggesting that very same thing. I mean, he spoke about the fact that our risk premium is getting worse. In other words, people that borrow from us are asking for high interest when we give their money back to them. That is an indication of the bond market, really. It's basically telling us that our risk is getting high. And I suppose is actually saying there are various different parts of government that need to do their work so that the situation can get rectified somewhat. Right now, all eyes are on the Reserve Bank. It shouldn't be that way.
It shouldn't be that way. And you're absolutely right. Look at the bond market, the capital market. That bombed out by something like 20 points. That means that the Minister of Finance is going to start getting into trouble. The fiscal accounts are unsustainable already. And he needs to spend less money. But this is, there's an election year coming next year. And I'm afraid politicians are not going to do what needs to happen, because there's an election. Politicians don't want to give us the bad medicine when there's an election around the corner. But eventually the markets are going to force them. And I think that's exactly what is happening now. The markets are telling us enough is enough. You better get your house in order, because we're not going to keep on investing in the economy that is mismanaged the way that you're mismanaging this economy.
All right, Davi, thanks very much indeed for that insight into the interest rate decision. Let me just give you some quick background here and context. 50 basis points increase today. The repo rate, which is the rate at which the Reserve Bank lends money to other banks, up to 8.25%. And then, of course, the prime rated bank, 11.75%. All 5 members of the MPC voting for a 50 basis point hike. Your loan repayments get a bit more higher from this afternoon. And that's where we leave it for now.
Thank you very much, Devon, for that. As I told you an hour ago or so, there'll be more analysis and more angles to be handled there. Tough times indeed. Money has just become that much tighter. Hopefully the rand does recover. Devon Murugan from our money desk. I'm sure you'll see him again soon on your screens here on ENCA, DSTV channel 403, after this big news of a 50 basis rate hike by the Reserve Bank. Its impact on us, there'll be more unpacking to be done. This is the 10th consecutive hike by the Reserve Bank over the last 18 months.